participants. We are moving to our second part, the discussion around the consciousness and the flow of change. This is going to be moderated by our third co-founder of the World Human Forum, which is Irène Papaligouras-Bataille. She's sitting in Paris. So I just hope technology is going to help us here and that Scott and Adrian will be able to find her, because Irène is going to be the moderator of that session, and she will be presenting our guests. There are three of them initially, Khalil Osiris, Nora Bateson, and Robert Nelson, and each of them sitting in another part of the world. Nora, I think, is sitting in Sweden, and Khalil is sitting somewhere in the US, and so does Robert Nelson. So I hope technology is going to help us here, and that we will find all our participants to discuss about consciousness, because yes, out of the 4 C's, consciousness is certainly the first one with which we have to start. Consciousness is what opens our hearts and makes us human, and therefore it is the first. Before we move on tomorrow to change, connection, and creation, those cannot happen unless we start with consciousness. So
this is the first session about our symphony program, and it will speak about consciousness. Despite centuries of debates by philosophers and scientists, the meaning of the word consciousness, at once the most familiar and the most mysterious aspect of our lives, remains puzzling and controversial. At its simplest, it means awareness of internal or external existence. But today, with all this brain research, consciousness often includes any kind of experience, cognition, feeling, or perception, and considers different levels or orders. For most philosophers, it is the relationship between the mind and the world. And for writers on spiritual topics, consciousness is the correlation between the mind and deeper truths, thought to be more fundamental than the physical world. So we can consider 3 types of consciousness: simple consciousness, which is awareness of the body possessed by many animals; self-consciousness, which is awareness of being aware, possessed only by humans, we believe; and at last, cosmic consciousness, awareness of the life and order of the universe, possessed only by humans who are enlightened. We at the World Human Forum, especially now after this COVID-19 crisis, which has awakened many human consciences, believe that all humans can and will be enlightened. An hour ago, Jochen presented you with the Delphi cube. We hope that this facilitating tool will help. I now have the pleasure to introduce you to our 3 charismatic and inspirational speakers, which will show you the way. Khalil Osiris will talk about the rise of self-awareness, which transformed him from a prisoner to a famous activist, speaker, and author. Nora Bateson, through her wonderful warm data process, will speak about exploring the complexity of interactions which leads to the development of a collective consciousness and results into interconnectedness, a major subject we are going to deal with tomorrow in Connection. Finally, Roger Nelson, through the story of the Global Consciousness Project, a unique 20-year scientific collaboration of researchers recording the effects of mass consciousness in response to major global events, will talk to us about the unity of consciousness of all people on the whole planet, and how adopting values such as caring, empathy, love, compassion can change the state of the physical world. So let me give the floor to Khalil.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. It's a joy to be here this morning. And well, for me, it's morning. I'm in Florida in the US, and it's a beautiful sunny day. I am so delighted to participate in the World Human Forum event like this, because I think particularly in this moment, many of us are revisiting these ancient existential questions. And the idea that we're talking about know thyself in the context of a global lockdown is quite interesting. Having spent 20 years in prison, when I hear the concept of lockdown and a global lockdown, and I watch how people have responded globally, I wonder, are they reflecting on the importance of know thyself? I wonder what they would have thought about themselves. I wonder if they actually reflect on how they thought of themselves pre-COVID-19 and how we're thinking of ourselves while we're in the midst of it. I know certainly in the US, there's quite a lot of dissidence. There's quite a lot of confusion about who we are as a nation and who we are even as individuals as we think about how to be well and how to build community. So I think it's quite timely to be talking about know thyself. And what I'd like to do is draw from 3 critical life lessons that inform my understanding of the maxim, know thyself. I mentioned briefly that I served 20 years in prison. And I reference that because before I went to prison as a young boy, as a teenager, I had an awareness of who I was. And that awareness informed the kind of behavior that I engaged in. It informed how I saw the world. And so for me, consciousness is being. It's actually being. It's not abstract. Consciousness is being. And so I want to talk about this subject of know thyself in a granular way. At every point that I was conscious, my behavior reflected a consciousness that I would have spoken to. And an example of that was my involvement or being conscientized by the Black Panther Party for self-defense as a teenager. And prior to that, I was just this happy-go-lucky kind of innocent young boy who thought the world was okay. Didn't really have an awareness of, I didn't really have a deep awareness of the deep social contradictions that existed. And I lived in a very comfortable neighborhood. But as I was conscientized by the Black Panther Party, my awareness shifted, my consciousness shifted, and so did my behavior. In the context of my childhood, my youth, that change in my behavior, that change in my consciousness that led to a change in behavior is what led ultimately to the delinquency and then the criminal behavior that resulted in a conviction at 17 years old. I say that because at the moment that I was actually convicted of a robbery at 17 years old and sent to prison, my consciousness was that I was wronged. I was a victim of a system that is systemically unjust, racist, and stacked against me as an individual. And that the real criminal was not me, but the very courts and system that had convicted me. That was my consciousness. And so I went to prison, served 5 years. This is 5 years as a 17-year-old thrown into maximum security prison. I thought I had a consciousness that I was a man as a 17-year-old until I met real men. And in my case, these men were brutal. So this shift in consciousness was something that was critical for me to begin to grasp in terms of my understanding of who I am. The ideal of know thyself became important at a granular level, being in prison where my life was in danger on a daily basis. I had to know what I was capable of. And let me just say this, I actually didn't know myself. The maxim, know thyself, I didn't know what I was capable of becoming. But that environment and those threats and the horror of my existence unfolded things that allowed me to look into a deep abyss, a mirror that before that point I was incapable of grasping. And I realized that I was capable of becoming something that I had never imagined. So to know thyself in those circumstances is quite a traumatic experience. To discover that you're capable of becoming something that you never imagined that was even human is something that changes you in a very deep and visceral way. So to come out of that as from a 17-year-old to 22-year-old, I served 5 years and was released from maximum security prison. And I forgot to mention that I was stabbed by Aryan Brotherhood members during that time. And so I was released, and my consciousness at that stage, if I would have tell you, know thyself, I would say to you in that moment, whatever it was imagined I was before I went to prison, at that point of release at 22 years old, having served 5 years and released from maximum security prison, I was worse than anything it was imagined I was. And in my consciousness, I was aware now that I was capable of things I had never imagined. And so that period taught me that consciousness is being. Be intentional. Be intentional. I want this conversation about know thyself to be granular. And then being intentional had consequences. Those consequences was I was intentionally criminal, antisocial. And within 3 years, I was rearrested. And at 25, I was sentenced at that point to 75 years, maximum sentence of 75 years. I was 25 years old, facing the rest of my life in prison. And so my consciousness was that I can choose to accept this circumstance or I can change it. And here's what I realized, that on the surface, it looked like my behavior had gotten me there. And I, on some level, didn't even understand my own behavior. But what I realized is this: behavior is learned. It can be unlearned. That's the second life lesson. But what I learned in the bowels of prison, having now been faced with the situation, being faced with the situation of the rest of my life in prison, what I learned there is something that was really the most radical lesson of all. And that is, imagination is the muse of consciousness. It's why observation affects reality. In other words, to draw from quantum physics to understand know thyself, quantum physics teaches us by the very act of watching, the observer affects the observed reality. So imagine that our consciousness allows us to observe ourselves, to arrive at a place of self-awareness. Whatever this observation process is, this self-reflective process is for each of us, it is in the very process of being conscious that we are able to affect our reality. So when I say consciousness is being, be intentional, there is a point at which consciousness is ignited to action. It is ignited to something bigger than its circumstance. And so that spark, if you will, that trigger, that catalyst is for me, was for me, has been for me in my entire life, imagination. And this is why I say imagination is the muse of consciousness. And then I draw from physics and say it's why, literally. Observation affects reality. So my reality has been changed, transformed dramatically by the transformation of my consciousness. And what I would say that Know Thyself is fundamentally about is the existential question. How are you using your consciousness to transform your life and create a better world for those who you find yourself in the presence of? What does that mean for you, for each of us at an existential level?
Thank you, Khalil. That was great. It's really interesting to put quantum physics here. I think it's important to know that we are, all of us, modifying reality by our consciousness, our action.
Yes.
Now I will hand off to Nora, who must be waiting for us.
Well, first of all, it's really nice to be here, and I guess I would like to just begin by saying that I think it's absolutely vital to acknowledge that we're in a moment in history at this very day in which there are transformations taking place that have been in the works for generations, centuries, in some cases, thousands of years. And I just want to really honor what Khalil brought in, and your experience, Khalil, is it's a voice of just fresh, real truth. And so thank you for that, because it's really all too easy to have a sense of what might be the best thing to produce in one's intention and to do that, but your story actually brings that down to the ground and into the edges. And I appreciate that very much. I want to pick up on one thing that you said, because before you said it, I put this quote into my chat to bring into this piece that I was going to bring in. And it's a quote actually from my father. And this quote says, "We can never be quite clear whether we are referring to the world as it is or to the world as we see it." And I think this is an important kind of counterpiece to what you brought in, Khalil, around observation affecting reality. So the kind of the place where I'm working is in this realm of bringing the interdependencies of the complex systems that we live within into view. I taught systems thinking and complexity theory for quite a while, and it was largely I just want to say that having a map of a system or producing a theoretical model of the complexity was really wonderful and really rich, but it actually didn't then reflect through the human beings that I was working with. So getting to a new kind of process through which I could create the conditions in which people would perceive that complexity themselves was a huge lift. Okay, this is this warm data work. And the reason I'm bringing this in is because I think it comes to bear around some of what you were saying, Khalil, and certainly I think why we're here today, which is that we have been soaking, okay, like sponges, or marinating like vegetables in the sauce of the ways of thinking that have come across generations that are deeply imbued with mechanism. And what mechanism does is it gives us the illusion that we could fix something, that you could reach in there, you could see the problem, and you could fix that problem. Like if the world was a giant wristwatch and you could find that problem, or you could replace that part. And so many of the sort of the change-making processes, the charities, the foundations, government policies, ministries, etc., are set up with committees to solve problems. The issue here is that when you go into a complex system like a culture or a family or a forest, a society, when something like a world pandemic happens, or you're looking at climate change, or you want to address ways of shifting the education system, for example, it's very tempting to isolate that thing you want to talk about and then believe that that is the is, and start to try to transform that thing, whatever it is, whether it's any of those things I mentioned. And what I want to bring in today around this question is, how are we actually perceiving the complexity that these life processes are taking place in? I had an interesting experience working with a group in Finland who were hoping to address some issues in the Ministry of Education to make changes in the education system there. And we started this process using the warm data work. And what became clear is this, that the education system, while it may appear to be flawed and it has all sorts of things wrong with it, and that we should go in and fix it, and I myself have spent my life doing that, so that when we began to look at it through an intersystemic transcontextual lens, what it looked like was that the education system is the shape that it is because of the pressures of the other systems that are around it. So the employment world puts pressure on the education system. The intergenerational conversation and the desires of parents who want their kids to succeed, the notion of identity and status, the cultural positioning of that, the political will to keep the various institutions in play that are in play, all of those things are shaping. They are the forms around which the education system must be. And so when we say we have to change the education system, what are we referring to? What are we perceiving? What is it in the way that even that impulse to move forward into contributing to a better world, how can we bring that perception into a broader, more relational, interrelational process, so that we might ask the question, not what do we need to fix about the education system, or what do we need to fix about this family or this person or this society, but how is it learning to be the way that it is? In what way is this particular version part of an expression of the conditions and the consequences that are taking place here? And I think this is an important question, because what it does actually is it completely rearranges your response. And that's an important beginning place. We've gone many decades hoping to make change by creating direct correctives to complex problems. And I guess what I really want to bring into this piece is what Khalil said, that observation affects reality. If the observation of the problem is that it's inside a mechanistic system and it can be directly responded to, that observation is going to produce the actions that then are going to come out probably as continuations of the existing system. So I know that there's days ahead where we're talking about change and all sorts of things, and I kind of want to seed that here. How are we perceiving these situations that we're in? How are you perceiving even your own self? How much complexity can you perceive in each other and in yourself? And what difference does that make when you start to see that complexity? I think I want to stop there. That's probably my time limit. Again, so where are the boundaries there between what we see and what our contexts that we've lived within, our language, our education, our, like Khalil, you did such a great job of describing that. What is it? How do you know the difference between what you see or what your contexts are bringing into your observations? I think if you ask that question, you start with humility, a recognition that I don't know where those edges are. And so there's a kind of rigor of carefulness and care to not go blindly, vehemently into the kind of projects that could be so seductively, wonderfully articulated, but just actually continue the existing problems. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nora. I found that what you said completed perfectly what Khalil said in the beginning. We are really in the flux of change. Now I will hand over to Roger Nelson, who will talk about the Global Consciousness Project and maybe about his book called Connected.
It's wonderful to be with this group. It's a group that should be world scale in size, because we are talking about something just extremely important for the future of the earth, for our future on the earth. I was struck by Khalil's mention that one of the points that he wants to make for people to understand is to be intention. And he went on to say, that matters, because being intention, in some sense, makes the world in which you then proceed to live. I started my career in, I guess, the study of consciousness with experiments that were about intention. Could we measure the effect of intention when it's directed to changing the world? And the answer to that question was yes, we could do that. It's a surprising answer and a very subtle kind of thing. But one of the things, I've now been at this for 40 years, and sometimes people ask me what's the most amazing or most impressive experiment or result you ever saw. And my answer to that is that over years, over many different kinds of experiments, over different laboratories doing these same kinds of experiments, we've found time after time that it simply doesn't go away. Very good scientists try hard to make an unusual thing. We call these unusual things anomalies. We try to make them go away. If they don't go away, we think that's a pretty good indication that they're real. So we showed to our satisfaction and to a kind of worldwide audience of people with open minds, that intention matters. Intention really does change the behavior of sensitive instruments in the laboratory. We took those out into the field also because we were interested not just in one person, but in a group. What would happen if we had a group of people who were all resonant and coherent for any number of different reasons? Perhaps they're all engaged in a ritual, which is, if you think about it, a human practice designed to bring us into a group, to make us into a group. Rituals, when we participate in, they create something that you can think of as a group consciousness. So we made miniaturized versions of our laboratory equipment. And by the way, the equipment that we used most of the time is called a random number generator. It's basically a high-speed coin flipper, you might say, electronic and based on quantum principles that mean that what this machine does is entirely unpredictable. So what we tried to get people to do was change that so it would become a little more predictable. And then when we went to the group consciousness situation, we said, if this is a group situation in which people become coherent with each other or resonate with each other, then we can predict that that group consciousness will act as a kind of information source to change the random number generator sequence. And again, we found that it did. That work led to a very much larger scale, ultimately to ask questions like, what if you have lots of random number generators? What if they're spread all over the world? So we created a network. Lots of people, friends, and eventually also people I didn't know, but with whom I became pretty good friends over the time. We created a world-spanning network of these devices, all of which were reporting random sequences back to servers in Princeton. And we began creating a kind of continuous sequence of data that should be random, should never show any structure at all, so that we could ask a very impertinent question in a way. What if a global consciousness, a mass consciousness on a global scale forms for some reason? Might that also, like a group consciousness, might a global consciousness change the way our systems behave? And once again, the answer is yes. We looked at things that were tragic. We looked at things that were joyful. We looked at terrorist attacks like the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington, which were, in some sense, not global. They were focused, but the reaction, the response, the human attention to that set of events was global. There's no question about that. And when the tsunami struck in the Indian Ocean and another one later in Japan, we saw, again, changes in the data because people were drawn into a kind of coherent mass consciousness extending over the globe by these events, which affect, which everybody perceives in somewhat the same way. The emotions are strongly aroused. And when our emotions are not just strongly aroused, but synchronized by events in the world, then they become sufficiently powerful to really change the world ever so slightly. Our changing of the world is in the form of random number generators creating sequences that should stay random, but which do not. They're physical devices. Their behavior changes in the face of something like global consciousness. But it isn't just terrorist attacks. We also look every time we have a New Year's celebration. That's not necessarily a terribly important thing, but people really do become synchronized. We start feeling the same feelings of maybe a celebration being together, thinking about a new year that will be even better than the last year, and so forth. And we looked at things, and by the way, the New Year's celebration changes the behavior of our system. So once again, now a kind of happy, maybe even unimportant occasion, but one in which really large numbers of people are participating and synchronized. We looked at things like the Kumbh Mela in India. It's a religious celebration, but something in every 12 years, there's a really big one. Something on the order of 20 or 30 million people all gather in northern India to bathe in the Ganges to wash away all their sins. And this also, we've looked at 4 of these events over the years, and they are remarkably similar one after another. They all show the same pattern of changing the behavior of this abstract set of instruments out in the world. So very much more recently, we also look at mass meditations. And the most recent one was Nurses Coherence 2020. And this is something that some of you will know about, and many hundreds of thousands, probably even millions of people participated in around the world. It was publicized somewhat on Florence Nightingale's 200th birthday. She was a kind of creator of the modern nursing profession and attitude. In any case, once again, we saw the changes in our data that we expect when people come together in a kind of coherent way. Now, in the midst of the COVID situation, where people are asking, what does the Global Consciousness Project see in this case? And we're not really prepared to look at long, drawn-out turmoil. That's not the way the instrument is designed, but we can take a look, a probe here and a probe there. And we found, and not surprisingly, that there is a disturbance in the atmosphere of our world that shows up in the data from this Global Consciousness Project. So what does this all mean? I think there are a few takeaways. If really large numbers of people come together and are deeply engaged, and especially if they synchronize themselves in emotional terms, we as a group become powerful. We become able to make changes in the world that surrounds us. Both Khalil and Nora said some things that are very much like this. If we are intentional, we can change the way our world is. If we are emotionally connected with each other and with the world in which we live, we can have a powerful and important effect on that world. We can change it for the better. So I think my work, which is really very much in the range and in the realm of science and data and statistics and so forth, it turns out that it says very clearly and strongly, we are connected. It's a very deep lying connection. It's at an unconscious level, and we don't ordinarily have access to that at all. But one of the things I think that the data suggests, and this 20-year-long project indicate, is that we should encourage ourselves and encourage everybody who we talk to try to become aware of that connection. Try to bring it up into awareness. Because I think when we are able to achieve kind of broader conscious awareness of our interconnection, our deep lying and powerful shared potential, that we can manifest that potential in a much more powerful way. And I'll just end with what I think are the very most important tools for this. We have found in these experiments, which we can categorize with regard to how big they are and what they represent in terms of emotions, we found that a couple of emotions stand out as most powerful. love and compassion. Those are the tools that we have, the most important and powerful tools that we have for becoming what we are potentially able to be, which is a kind of layer of intelligence for the earth, what Teilhard de Chardin called the noosphere. And there is, as Irène mentioned, a book called Connected, which tells the story, has lots of statistics, but also wonderful, beautiful quotations from people of great wisdom. I thank you all for listening to this, and I guess we have a chance to take questions. Is that right?
We'll have a little question session because there will be a surprise waiting for us in 7 minutes exactly. But first, I saw that Nora wanted to talk or to have us talk about art. And I think art is really very important because it's pure emotion and it mobilizes the right part of the brain, which is the part, I guess, which is mobilized when you work on your warm data, right, Nora?
Oh, she's muted. You have to unmute, Nora.
There we go.
Good.
Yeah, I love that someone brought art up because I think that it's a really important, it's so important. It's essential. It's like oxygen. When you look at, the most devastating moments of human experience, there's art. And part of that has to do with the possibility that art brings of actually perceiving in new ways. Art asks us to be more loose, more able to perceive things we maybe hadn't perceived before. When you look at this chair, is it just a chair? Is this chair the perfect rendition of a chair? Or when you get into the surrealist version or an artist's expression of a chair, you get to see not just the chair, but how somebody else might perceive that chair, and maybe even how you perceive somebody else perceiving the chair. And so the arts are like, if we are bound in a matrix of basically patterns of thinking that get reified everywhere we go, then it's extreme experiences with nature, deep connective experiences, and the arts that are going to be those openings where change can happen. So I just, humor, right? Humor shows us where the edge of one frame of perception is, and plays with that edge, pushes on that edge, gives us some room to wiggle that edge so we can lightly, even sometimes around the most serious, consequential subjects, hold multiple processes in mind simultaneously without making a thing of it. We just do it.
Right. I have a question from one of the participants who, one of you talked about humility. And when you think about humility, the root word is humus, humus being the earth, and human is somebody made of earth. So I would like to ask Khalil his opinion about humus and humility, and how the consciousness of being humility, humus, human, really changes things.
Well, thank you so much for that question. What it makes me think of is a quote by Maya Angelou, where she says, "Nothing human is unfamiliar to me." And I think what she was asking us to reflect on is the interconnectedness of our humanity. that it is born of the earth that we share. The earth that we don't just share in some objective way, but that we share in terms of our very being, our very existence. And so humility is what, for me at a very personal level, is what allowed me in my circumstance of being, feeling humiliated. It allowed me to find in the people who I had objectified as my captors, the people who I had objectified as my enemies. It allowed me to gain insight into the fact that underneath all of the things that divided us, which I participated in, which I was complicitous in creating, underneath all of that was our shared humanity, which requires of us a level of humility, a level of honoring, of respecting deeply this connectedness. And so humility is the pathway out of a place of one being within a group that's marginalized and historically humiliated, and all of those things that lead to this victim consciousness. Oftentimes we think it's fight and rail against that system as the mechanism by which to most effectively disrupt it. But I would remind you that Abraham Lincoln once said, "I destroy my enemies by making them my friends."
Yeah, that's great. And there's a last question I would like to put to Roger. You know, Roger, you have heard, of course, about the overview effect. Though it was these astronauts which were pure scientific and went to space for some experiment and had the most emotional experience over there. And what you talked about, your project, which was a purely scientific project in the beginning, seems to have finally been an emotional project. What would you say about that?
Well, in fact, it started with a kind of inspirational reverence for this Jesuit priest and spiritual mentor of many people, Teilhard de Chardin. He wrote about the future of man. And he said basically that we are in a process of evolution. We may think that we're the pinnacle of evolution, but we're not finished. We have another stage to go into or go through. And that would be, that new stage would be something that, again, back to Khalil's remark about being intentional. We have the capacity and the responsibility, ultimately, to be a kind of shell of intelligence, a sheath of intelligence, which is called noosphere, from knowing. And it's like an ionosphere or an atmosphere, but it's made of knowing. When we can do that, when we have large numbers of people who believe in something like that, then we will become not the dominators, but the caretakers of the earth. And we have to be humble in order to do that. We have to recognize that humility allows us to connect with each other, respect each other. And by the way, I wanted to remark on art. It's a language that we all speak. There is no place on earth that doesn't respond and understand art in much the same way. Our languages, our words are sometimes confusing, but art is always immediately present for us.
Thank you, Roger.